Would you believe me if I told you I would never, ever confess to something I didn't do?
I believe that you believe that, yes. That's what everybody says. I would never confess to something I didn't do.
I'm not only certain I wouldn't confess, if I was a juror
Yes.
and somebody did confess, as
Yes.
far as I'm concerned, case closed.
Absolutely. Your belief that you would never confess to a crime you didn't commit is your frame of reference for evaluating others. And it's a fair frame of reference. We do it all the time. It's basic common sense. People don't easily confess to crimes they didn't commit. Something has to happen.
Does it make it easier for a jury to convict? I mean, it's hard being a juror. You've got someone's fate in your hands, and here they come and say, I did it.
Yes.
Does it make it easier?
To convict in
To be a jury to convict?
Oh, absolutely. And let's keep in mind, let's define what a confession is that goes to a jury. It's not a simple 5-word statement. It's an admission of guilt coupled with a chronological story of this is what I did, this is how I did it, this is who I was with, this is where we were, this is how it came down, this is why I did it. It's a full story. And confessions contain details. And in some ways, I think the most shocking statistic about false confessions, where we now know in hindsight that the confessor was innocent, is that 95% or so of false confessions contain details about the crime that were spot on accurate, that were not known to the public. So what's a jury to do when they're faced with a handwritten or even more convincing, a videotaped confession from a defendant who not only says, I did it, but here are the facts, and those facts are correct.
So the confession that the jury sees, whether on videotape or typed up, it's the end product of a longer process.
It is the end product of sometimes a very long process. And the length of that process is actually an important variable. On average, research from various domains, different places, shows the typical interrogation takes somewhere between 30 minutes and 2 hours. If you want to encompass the vast majority of interrogations, they take up to 4 hours. People have a breaking point, and time breaks people down. Time brings with it fatigue, a deprivation of certain need states. Particularly important is that people being interrogated are sitting alone in a room, no friends, no family, not a lawyer present, and they don't have access to social support cues. And if all of that is off camera, how is a judge to know when he needs to rule as such? How does a judge know that that statement, that end product, as you put it, was voluntarily taken? And how does a jury know, what they're tasked to do, that the statement taken is credible and true? How can they know that unless they watch the process?
And oh, by the way, the detective can lie to the defendant legally.
In the United States, a detective can legally lie about the evidence to a suspect. In most Western civilized countries, that's not allowed. But in the U.S., and the Supreme Court hasn't revisited this issue in some 50 years, it is lawful for detectives to turn to a suspect and say, you say you didn't do this, but we've got your fingerprints on the murder weapon. Or we have a victim who had hair in her grasp, and we tested the hair, it's yours. Or the shoe prints we found at the scene are yours. Or that polygraph you wanted to take, you failed it.
Okay, I get all that, but yet I know everything you just said is false. So why would I confess?
One possibility is the suspect who knows he's innocent, knows he didn't do it, is starting to feel set up and railroaded. And I don't know what's happening here, but it sounds like they're going to convict me, whether I prosecute and convict me, whether I confess or not. The officer, the detective, once the suspect understands that they have, or believes they have evidence of guilt, shifts gears somewhat. The interplay is, you know what, I think you're a good person. I don't think you intended to do this. In fact, something tells me maybe you were provoked, maybe you had too much to drink, maybe somebody put you up to it, maybe you didn't realize that what you're doing was a crime. I think that it just happened. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe you didn't intend for this to happen. What the suspect hears, even if the detective doesn't explicitly say so, is, oh, they don't think this is a big deal. Well, okay, then maybe confession will result in some degree of leniency. There are a certain number of cases in which the confessor, the innocent confessor, not only capitulates as an act of compliance, but actually starts to get confused about his own guilt or innocence, and in some cases internalizes the belief in his own guilt. Now,
they actually think they did it.
Yes, yes. There was a moment that you see this in a number of cases, because whenever you look at false confession cases, once we know they're false confessions, almost invariably lies about evidence are present in those interrogations.
Just to put this in perspective, how common are false confessions?
Nobody can attach a number. So if what you're asking is what percentage of the time that an innocent person is interrogated, does that interrogation produce a confession? Nobody can answer that question. There are too many missing data points. What we do know is this. Confession evidence has always been considered something of a gold standard. Legal scholars in the U.S. have recognized that when you have a confession, you're basically going to get a conviction at trial. Elsewhere in the world, it's referred to as the king of evidence, the queen of evidence, whatever the term is, people have assumed confession evidence. One of the problems with confession evidence is not only does the confessor get convicted at trial, but today, particularly today, with a guilty plea rate of 97 or 98% nationally, an individual confesses to police. He recants the confession, comes in a lawyer, and says to the lawyer, I didn't do this. I want to go to trial. They don't have evidence. I didn't do this. They coerced me. The lawyers, for good reason, are advising, you've confessed, you're going to get convicted at trial, and so they advise often to take a guilty plea. When you've confessed to police, you are now under pressure to repeat that confession in a guilty plea to a district attorney, because you're weighing the odds and you're being told you're going to get convicted. So there are all of these invisible cases in which people plead guilty, making it doubly difficult to make a post-conviction claim of innocence later.
Let's talk specifically about the Central Park Five. 5 guys ultimately confessed. Did that set off any bells to you when it initially happened?
You know, I'm a native New Yorker, and by 1989, I was very interested in false confessions. So that case, at that time, got my attention. There was a lot about the confessions as I read through the newspapers that weren't making sense. The boys seemed to not know certain things. They seemed to have made certain mistakes. This was 5 boys. High-profile crime in the middle of Manhattan, and the whole world was watching. So I remember at the time thinking, wow, something's not right here. On the other hand, 5 false confessions? How's that possible? Well, we now know since that case, there are numbers of cases like this involving 4 or 5 or 6 confessors, all of whom turned out to be innocent. It's a powerful process, and when you have multiple possible suspects, and the claim that detectives are making to each suspect is the other suspect is implicating you, it's not so unusual.
What do we know about the process involving the Central Park Five that led up to their confession?
When you look at the Central Park Five, why should we have been suspicious? Well, first off, they're 14 to 16 years old. And among the many risk factors for false confessions, one of those red flags that should go up is the question, how old are these kids? 14 to 16-year-old being interrogated using methods and tactics that were built for adults, that's not a fair fight. Juveniles are, adolescents. Their brain is a work in progress, according to the American Medical Association. They are short-term thinkers. They are compliant. They are suggestible. Everything about bringing a 14 or 16-year-old into a room with 2 homicide or sex crimes detectives, something right away, a bell should go off.
They told me that they just wanted to go home.
Yes. And when an innocent confessor is ultimately exonerated, and the first question any reporter asks of them is, so why did you confess? Their answer is always something like, because I wanted to go home. Now, the average person scratches his or her head. Wait, you thought you were going to confess to involvement in a rape and go home? What were you thinking? Each one actually saw his own confession as a ticket home. When they were handcuffed and arrested, they and the family members of theirs who were present were shocked. They thought they were going home. And that's not uncommon. That's often what false confessors report. I thought I was going home. I thought I made the situation better for myself.
Do most people believe they can spot a false confession, that they can spot a lie?
Yeah, wouldn't you? if I'd know a false confession if I saw one. I heard that phrase so many times. I'd know a false confession if I saw one. But prosecutors believe if I saw that confession, I'd know if it was false. Judges, if I saw that confession, I'd know it was false. Jurors, same thing. Police, same thing. People believe they can spot a false confession. Well, guess what? You can't. In general, psychologists have found over the past 50 years or so that, first of all, we are terrible as human lie detectors. We can't distinguish truths and lies almost any better than flipping a coin. Second, we know that police aren't a whole lot better. In fact, neither are judges and psychiatrists and customs inspectors and others who've been tested a whole lot better. So there's a general phenomenon that says you can't necessarily tell when someone is lying. Confessions add to the fact that, first of all, I don't believe innocent people would confess. So my instinct when I see a confession, particularly on video, he's looking at the camera confessing to a crime. How could that be false? Secondly, what's coming across in that confession, now mind you, I'm talking about false confessions. We've analyzed them. Others have analyzed them. Is not just an admission of guilt. It's an admission of guilt followed by a narrative. And that narrative contains details about the crime. Those details about the crime are sometimes spot on accurate. Those details are sometimes exquisitely vivid. Those details lead a jury, and I've heard mock jurors deliberating when I play confessions to them, and you hear them say things like, yeah, I know he says he's innocent, and he says he was coerced, and I get all that, but then how did he know those things? They can't get past the fact that the suspect knows about the crime in a way that only the perpetrator could have known. Now, if that jury doesn't have access to the videotape of the process, they can't answer that question. Turns out that 95% of known false confessions contain facts about the crime that are accurate and not in the public domain. If the jury doesn't watch the process, they have no way of knowing where those facts came from.
Those facts should be introduced then by the detective.
They're being introduced. Now, it doesn't mean they're doing it purposefully. It could be perfectly inadvertent and innocent. But during the process of interrogation, an interrogation is a conversation. And when two people have a conversation, if I ask you a question, I'm not just asking the question to elicit information from you, but in asking that question, I am inadvertently communicating information to you. If the suspect is in 10 or 12 hours of interrogation, by the time they're done, that suspect knows a whole lot about the crime through the questions. So, maybe, as in the Central Park 5 case, detectives showed the suspect photos of the victim. You shouldn't do that. Give them secondhand access to crime-related information. Or, in the Central Park 5 case, Kevin Richardson and Corey Wise were taken to the crime scene before their statements were taken. You took them to the crime scene? So now we're supposed to be impressed when they show up in an interrogation, look at the camera, and describe the crime scene? Those secondhand forms of information, we in the field of the study of wrongful convictions refer to that as contamination. Detectives will contaminate a statement inadvertently. It doesn't have to be a purposeful, malicious thing. But through the process of interrogation, by asking suggestive and leading questions, they're communicating all the facts necessary for a suspect to give a good confession. So, if you bring a suspect to that point where that suspect is now motivated to convince you that, here's my statement, I'm trying to do this right, that statement can contain facts about the crime that suspect received through this process of contamination.
How do we lessen the rate of false confessions?
There is now a wave of reform through this country to ensure that the process of interrogation is videotaped from start to finish. No excuses. Start to finish. The reason that's important is, imagine in the Central Park 5 case, if there was a camera in the room where detectives were badgering these kids for some 14 to 30 hours. In fact, everything in basic psychology and research suggests that if there is a camera present in the room, Detectives will likely dial down the use of certain tactics that they know judges and juries won't like when they see it. So that's one advantage, is that the presence of a camera, the presence of a recording, might actually in and of itself reduce the number of false confessions that get taken. Memory is very fallible. A detective's retrospective notes about what went on during that session, they're not going to be accurate. Not because they're lying, necessarily, but because people's memory for conversations are inaccurate. And so the second important reason for video recording is it provides an objective look at reality, that there's no question later as to what was said, what was done. And then the third reason, and I think this is in some ways the most important, is assuming that sometimes too much pressure will be brought to bear on a suspect and a false confession will be taken. We have to rebuild those safety nets. We have to make it possible for a prosecutor to watch that process and say, wait a second, you put a lot of pressure there. That lie about evidence, you can see the change in his face. We have to make it possible for judges who rule on voluntariness, for juries who determine if the confession is true. We have to make it possible for them to see the data. And so I'm convinced that the presence of a video camera will make fact finders more accurate fact finders. The idea that I'd know a false confession if I saw one? No, not if you're only watching the confession, but you stand a better chance if you're watching the whole process before that confession is taken.
What do you advise an innocent person to do if they find themselves in an interrogation room under those kind of circumstances that you described?
You know, the Supreme Court in 1966 gave us our Miranda rights. Our rights to sit there and remain silent, refuse to speak, and our rights to an attorney. At the time that the Supreme Court gave us those rights, the law enforcement community was absolutely convinced that nobody will ever talk to them again, and that they would cease to ever be able to solve crimes by confession. That didn't happen. The waiver rate is historically, both in the U.S. and in other countries that have Miranda-like rights, the waiver rate is typically very high. When you break down the waiver rate and look at it separately for people who've turned out to be innocent, and we've brought this phenomenon into a laboratory where we have innocent or guilty people of a mock crime, and we bring them in to interrogate them and offer their Miranda rights. Overwhelmingly, all research shows that innocent people waive their rights. They don't see the need for it. They don't grasp the gravity. People believe in their own innocence. They believe in justice. They believe that their own innocence will prevail, that we'll talk and he'll realize I didn't do this. And so Miranda is the advice I give. If it gets ugly, exercise your Miranda rights.